The fire came first. It tore through the wooden barracks like a living thing, orange and furious, and climbing the walls and curling across the roof beams until the night sky above Camp Hearn glowed the color of a dying sun. Then came the screaming. German voices, American voices, bootsteps on dry Texas dirt, the crack of a warning shot fired into the air. And in the middle of it all, one man. He stood between two worlds. His right hand was raised toward the American soldiers who had their rifles leveled and ready. His left hand was stretched toward a group of German prisoners carrying torches and broken table legs. He was shouting in two languages. In German, he begged his countrymen to stop. In English, he begged the guards not to shoot. 6 months earlier, this man had sworn he would never speak a single word of English. 6 months earlier, he believed that America was the enemy of everything he loved. 6 months earlier, he was still Oberleutnant Friedrich Eckhardt of the Afrika Korps, a man who believed that honor meant absolute loyalty to one side and one side only. But tonight, standing between fire and rifles, Friedrich Eckhardt understood that true honor lives in a different place entirely. To understand how he got there, we need to go back 6 months, to a scorching day on the desert sand of Tunisia, and to a moment that Friedrich would spend the rest of his life trying to make right. But that moment and the letter connected to it would not reveal its full meaning for a long time, because the letter was written by a young American soldier the night before he died, and it sat unopened in a desk drawer in Texas for 3 months, waiting for a father who was too afraid to read his own son's last words. We will come back to that letter. But first, the desert, September 1943, Tunisia. The war in North Africa was over, but Friedrich Eckhardt did not feel like a man at the end of anything. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff with nothing below him but darkness. 3 weeks earlier, his younger brother Helmut had died in his arms. Helmut was 22 years old. He had been a mathematics student in Dresden before the war reached into the university and pulled him out by the collar. A piece of shrapnel from an Allied airstrike had torn through the supply convoy they were both traveling with. Friedrich held Helmut on the side of the road while the sand turned red beneath them. Helmut looked up at his older brother and said his last words, "Tell mother I am not in pain." It was a lie. Friedrich knew it was a lie. Helmut's hands were shaking and his eyes were full of terror. But Friedrich nodded and said, "Yes, I will tell her," and he held his brother's hand until it went still. From that moment, Friedrich carried two things with him everywhere: the memory of Helmut's face and a hatred for the nation whose bombs had killed him. He did not hate Americans because of ideology. He was not a Nazi. He had never joined the party. He was a history teacher from Dresden who had been conscripted in 1940 because the war needed bodies more than it needed believers. But hatred does not need ideology. It only needs loss. And Friedrich had lost the only person in the world who called him brother. When his unit was surrounded by the American 1st Infantry Division near Tunis, Friedrich fought until there was nothing left to fight with. Then he surrendered. Not because he wanted to live, but because dying felt like it would be too easy, like an escape he did not deserve. In the chaos of capture, a bullet fragment lodged in his left shoulder. He fell. An American soldier, young, barely older than Helmut, ran to him. The American did not shoot. He knelt down, pulled out a field bandage, and began wrapping Friedrich's wound. Friedrich looked at the name stitched on the soldier's uniform. Dawson. That was all he could read before the pain blurred his vision. Friedrich spat in the American's face. The soldier stopped, wiped his cheek with the back of his hand, looked at Friedrich for a long moment, then continued bandaging the wound without a word. Friedrich did not know that the soldier named Dawson had written a letter about him that very night. He did not know what was in that letter, and he did not know that 6 months later the letter would change everything. But we are not there yet. The letter is still waiting. On the transport ship crossing the Atlantic, Friedrich met two men who would come to define the next chapter of his life. The first was a boy. The second was a shadow. Erich Vogt was 19 years old. He had been a music student at the Berlin Conservatory before the Wehrmacht pulled him into uniform in 1942. He was not a soldier. He was a cellist who happened to be holding a rifle instead of a bow. When he was captured, the only thing he managed to save was a small notebook filled with musical notation. He clutched it the way other men clutch photographs of their wives. Erich was thin, pale, frightened, and utterly unfit for war. He did not believe in the Nazi cause. He did not hate anyone. He simply wanted to survive long enough to play music again. Otto Langner was 35, a Hauptmann in the 15th Panzer Division. He was not SS, but he was a believer. Not in Hitler specifically, but in Germany. In its strength, in its right to dominate, and more than anything in its right to be angry. Otto's belief had been sharpened into something lethal by a single event. In July 1943, the Allied bombing of Hamburg, an operation the history books call Operation Gomorrah, killed over 37,000 civilians in a firestorm that turned entire neighborhoods into ash. Among them was Otto's younger sister Lotte. She was 23 years old. She played the violin. She had been studying to become a teacher. She died in the basement of her apartment building when the ceiling collapsed and the fire consumed everything above her. Otto received the news of Lotte's death 2 days before he was captured. The grief did not make him soft. It made him iron. He swore on the memory of his sister that he would never let a single German prisoner bow before the Americans. Not one. He would hold the line. He would keep German pride unbroken. Because if he let that pride crack, then Lotte's death would mean nothing. And Otto could not survive in a world where Lotte's death meant nothing. Otto Langner was not a monster. And that was the most frightening thing about him. On the ship, Otto established control quickly. He was the highest-ranking officer among the prisoners in their section of the hold. He spoke with quiet authority. He enforced discipline not with fists, but with something more effective: shame. Any prisoner who showed weakness, who expressed curiosity about America, who spoke too kindly about their captors, would receive a look from Otto that said everything. You are betraying the dead. Most prisoners fell in line. Erich signed whatever Otto put in front of him because he was too afraid to refuse. Friedrich watched from a distance, arms crossed, saying nothing. He shared Otto's contempt for the Americans, but for his own reasons. Every time the ship rocked and the American guards walked past, Friedrich closed his eyes and saw Helmut's face. But there was one moment on that crossing that Friedrich would remember decades later. One evening, Erich sat alone in a corner of the hold, and he began to whistle, softly, almost inaudibly, a melody that rose and fell like breath itself. A few prisoners nearby stopped talking and listened, then a few more. Within minutes, a small circle had formed around the boy, and the hold was quiet except for that single fragile thread of music. Otto watched from across the hold. His expression was unreadable. Friedrich watched too, and for the first time since Helmut died, he felt something other than anger. He did not have a word for it yet. It was small, like a crack in a stone wall that lets in a thin line of light. He pushed it away, but it had already entered. On that ship, 3 men sailed toward the same destination without knowing that their fates would braid together in ways none of them could imagine. One would save another's life, one would nearly take another's life, and one would have to make a choice that he would carry to his final breath. But all of that was still ahead. The ship was still crossing the Atlantic, and America was still just a word. When the transport ship entered New York Harbor, the prisoners were brought up on deck in groups. Friedrich stood at the railing and looked out at something he had been taught did not exist. Cranes taller than cathedral spires, warehouses stretching in rows so long they vanished into haze, ships by the dozen freighters and destroyers and troop transports lined up with the precision of a military parade, trucks rolling along the waterfront in an endless mechanical river. Friedrich had been told that America was a nation of jazz musicians and immigrants, a patchwork country too soft and too divided to fight a real war. That was what the propaganda said. That was what his officers repeated. That was what he himself believed, because believing it was easier than admitting that the people who killed Helmut might actually be strong. But standing on that deck looking at the scale of what America had built, while fighting a war on 2 fronts across 2 oceans, Friedrich felt the first tremor of doubt. He said nothing, his jaw tightened. His hand gripped the railing until his knuckles whitened. Otto, standing nearby, scoffed loudly enough for everyone to hear. Propaganda. They are showing us their best face. It means nothing. Some prisoners nodded. Erich just stared, his mouth slightly open, his notebook forgotten in his hand. The train ride west lasted 2 days. The prisoners sat behind barred windows and watched a nation scroll past them like a film they had not been told existed. Farmland so vast it took hours to cross. Cities with buildings that caught the sunlight and threw it back in sheets of gold. Highways filled with automobiles, not military vehicles, but private cars driven by ordinary people going to ordinary places. Factories with smokestacks that never stopped. Children playing in yards with green grass and white fences. Friedrich forced himself to look away. Every time the landscape impressed him, he punished himself by remembering Helmut, by remembering the sound Helmut made when the shrapnel hit, by remembering the lie. I am not in pain. He used his brother's death like a wall, building it higher every time America threatened to make him feel something other than hatred. But walls have cracks, and the cracks were already forming. Camp Hearn sat in the middle of Texas like a small, orderly island, surrounded by an ocean of brown grass and cattle ranches. The prisoners arrived in November 1943, stepping off the trucks into air that smelled like dust, dry hay, and something else. Something Friedrich could not identify at first. It was the smell of open space, of land that stretched so far in every direction that the horizon seemed like a suggestion rather than a boundary. For a man who had spent months in the cramped confines of North African trenches, in the steel belly of a transport ship, the sheer openness of Texas was almost disorienting. The camp itself was not the nightmare they had expected. Wooden barracks, simple but clean, bunks with mattresses, stoves for heat, windows that actually open, a mess hall that served meals 3 times a day. And those meals, bread, meat, vegetables, coffee, real coffee, not the burnt grain substitute they had choked down in the last months of the Africa Corps. For men who had grown used to hunger as a constant companion, this was not just food. It was a message. And the message said something that none of them were ready to hear. First Sergeant Harold Dawson was 52 years old. He was a cattleman from Hearn who had volunteered for service in 1942, despite being past the age when most men were called. He volunteered because his son, Private First Class Jimmy Dawson, 22 years old, had enlisted before him, and Hal could not sit on his ranch while his boy was overseas. The Army did not send Hal to the front. They sent him here to manage a prisoner of war camp in his own hometown, and Hal accepted the assignment the way he accepted everything, with a nod and without complaint. You serve where they put you. Hal ran Camp Hearn the way he ran his ranch, firm, fair, no nonsense. His rules were simple, and he stated them once to every new group of prisoners. Follow the Geneva Convention. Nobody gets beaten, nobody goes hungry, nobody gets treated different from what the rules say. That is how Americans do things. He did not say this with pride or with warmth. He said it the way a man states a fact about the weather. It is Tuesday, it is raining. We follow the rules. Hal did not hate the German prisoners. He did not have enough spare emotion for hatred. His worry was reserved for Jimmy, who was somewhere in North Africa, and for Margaret, his wife, who kept the general store in town running while writing letters to their son every single night. Sergeant Ray Cutler was 34, a former corn farmer from Oklahoma who had enlisted in 1942. Ray was assigned to Camp Hearn as a guard, and he performed his duties with mechanical precision. He counted prisoners every morning. He checked barracks every evening. He spoke to the Germans only when necessary and only in short, flat commands. Move. Stop. Return to barracks. Nobody at Camp Hearn knew why Ray Cutler was the way he was. They assumed it was just his nature. Quiet men were common enough in the Army, but Ray's silence was not natural. It was a wound that he carried in his chest the way other men carry shrapnel. His son, Corporal Danny Cutler, 20 years old, had been killed at Anzio in January 1944. Ray received the news 3 months after arriving at Camp Hearn. From that day forward, every German face he saw in the camp was a reminder that his boy was in the ground, and these men were alive. He never struck a prisoner. He never broke a regulation. But he also never said a word that was not required. And every morning when he counted the prisoners standing in formation, he thought the same thought. Nobody counted Danny. Ray Cutler hated every German prisoner in Camp Hearn. Everyone in the camp could see it in his eyes. But nobody knew the reason. Not yet. Margaret Dawson was 48. She ran Dawson's General Store on the main street of Hearn, a small shop that sold everything from flour to fishing line. She was the kind of Texas woman who could butcher a chicken balance, a ledger, and write a 3-page letter to her son overseas all before noon. Margaret received Jimmy's letters more regularly than Hal did because Jimmy knew his mother worried more, and his father would never admit to worrying at all. Margaret hid the saddest letters from Hal, the ones where Jimmy sounded tired, the ones where Jimmy sounded scared. She carried those letters in her apron pocket during the day and read them again at night after Hal was asleep. 1 week after arriving at Camp Hearn, Friedrich was called to the camp office. Hal Dawson sat behind a wooden desk, a cup of coffee in his hand, a stack of paperwork in front of him. He informed Friedrich in a tone as flat as the Texas landscape that as the highest-ranking officer in Compound B, Friedrich was responsible for maintaining internal discipline among the prisoners. Geneva Convention, Article 43. Any problems, report to me. Friedrich nodded. He turned to leave. And then Hal spoke again. Eckhart. The tone was different now. Quieter, almost private, as if Hal were talking to himself rather than to a prisoner. My son served in North Africa, 1st Infantry Division. His name was Jimmy. Friedrich stopped. The 1st Infantry Division. That was the unit that captured him. Dawson on the uniform of the soldier who bandaged his shoulder. Hal continued. He wrote me a letter from Tunisia. In one of his letters, he told me about a German officer he bandaged on the battlefield, wounded in the shoulder. Jimmy said the officer spat in his face. Hal looked at Friedrich. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted like a door opening onto a dark room. Jimmy wrote, Dad, I am not angry. I just thought if I were captured, I would hope someone would bandage me too. Silence filled the office like water filling a glass. Jimmy died 2 weeks after he wrote that letter. Artillery fragment at El Guitar. Friedrich stood absolutely still. The room felt smaller. The air felt thicker. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What do you say to a father who knows you spat in his dead son's face? Hal took a sip of coffee, set the cup down. That is all, Eckhart. Dismissed. Friedrich walked out of the office and into the Texas sun. His legs carried him to the barracks, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. It was in Tunisia on a dusty road, looking up at a young American soldier who was wrapping a bandage around his shoulder while blood from Friedrich's wound dripped onto the soldier's hands. The soldier's face had been a blur then, just a shape above him, backlit by the North African sun. But now the shape had a name, Jimmy Dawson, and Jimmy Dawson was dead. That night, lying on his bunk, Friedrich stared at the ceiling and felt something he had not felt since the war began. Not guilt exactly, something deeper and more corrosive. Shame. He had spat in the face of the man who saved his life, and that man had died believing that Friedrich deserved mercy anyway. Friedrich did not sleep. He lay in the dark and listened to the breathing of the men around him. Somewhere outside, a coyote howled across the Texas flatland, and somewhere in Hal Dawson's office, in the bottom drawer of a wooden desk, there was one more letter. The last letter Jimmy ever wrote. The one he wrote the night before the shell landed. Hal had not opened it. 3 months and he could not bring himself to break the seal. Because as long as the letter stayed closed, Jimmy had not yet spoken his final word. And as long as Jimmy had not spoken his final word, some small irrational part of Hal could still believe his son was alive. That letter would wait, but not forever. And when it was finally opened, it would change 2 men on opposite sides of a war in ways that neither of them could have predicted. But that night in Camp Hearn, with coyotes calling in the distance and the Texas stars burning white above the barbed wire, Friedrich Eckhart only knew one thing. The wall of hatred he had built so carefully, brick by brick, since Helmut died in his arms on that road in Tunisia, now had a crack in it. Not because the Americans were kind, not because the food was good or the barracks were clean, but because a young man named Jimmy Dawson had bandaged the wound of a man who spat in his face and then wrote home to his father saying he was not angry. That is the kind of crack that walls do not recover from. 2 weeks later, Otto Langner called every prisoner in Compound B into the barracks after lights out. He stood at the front of the room, straight back, jaw set, and presented a document he had written himself. He called it the Hearn Oath. Every prisoner was to sign it. The terms were clear: no learning English, no reading American newspapers, no participating in any cultural program organized by the Americans, no fraternizing with guards beyond the minimum required. Those who signed would be protected. Those who did not would be considered suspect. Most men signed. They signed because Otto's voice carried the weight of authority and grief. They signed because refusing felt like betraying the dead. They signed because in a prison camp surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards in a foreign country, the only power they had was the power to remain who they were. And Otto promised them that power. Eric signed with a trembling hand. He did not want to, but he was 19 and alone and afraid. Friedrich picked up the pen. He looked at the document. He looked at Otto. Then he put the pen down. I do not sign anything that does not come from an official commanding officer of the German military. The barracks went silent. 30 men held their breath. This was the first time anyone had openly challenged Otto Langner. Otto studied Friedrich for a long moment. His expression was calm, almost gentle. That was the most dangerous version of Otto the Gentle One. I understand, Oberleutnant. Time will show who is right. Friedrich held his gaze. Neither man blinked. Then Otto turned and walked to his bunk, and the meeting was over. That night, after the barracks went dark, Friedrich heard footsteps outside the window. Someone standing in the shadows watching. He could not see who it was. But he knew with the certainty of a man who has just drawn a line in the sand that something had shifted. He was no longer simply a prisoner in Camp Herne. He was a target. And in a place like this, where men had nothing left but their pride and their pain, being a target could mean anything at all. Winter came to Texas the way it comes to places that do not expect it. Not with the heavy snowfall of Dresden or the frozen mud of Tunisia, but with a dry, cutting wind that blew across the flatland and slipped through every crack in the wooden barracks like an uninvited guest. The prisoners were issued wool coats, thick socks, and extra blankets. Otto Langner accepted the winter clothing without comment, but that evening he stood in the barracks and reminded every man within earshot of his interpretation. They keep us warm so we can work for them. Do not confuse efficiency with generosity. Friedrich said nothing. He pulled on his coat and walked outside into the cold air and stood by the fence looking out at the Texas prairie. The grass had turned from green to gold to brown, and the cattle on the distant ranches moved in slow, heavy clusters, their breath making small clouds in the morning chill. It was beautiful in a way that made him uncomfortable. Beauty was not something he had given himself permission to notice since Helmut died. The labor system at Camp Herne operated under the rules of the Geneva Convention. Officers like Friedrich and Otto were not required to work, but enlisted men and non-commissioned officers were assigned to labor details outside the camp. They repaired roads, they cleared brush, they picked cotton, they helped local farmers with harvests, and they were paid, not in biennial, but in canteen coupons that could be exchanged for cigarettes, soap candy, razor blades, and sometimes even beer. For men who had expected chains and starvation, the idea that their captors would pay them for work was so strange that many prisoners simply did not believe it at first. They waited for the trick. The trick never came. Friedrich, though exempt from labor, volunteered to supervise the work details. He told himself it was because he was bored. He told himself it was because an officer should watch over his men. But the truth he would not admit, even in the privacy of his own thoughts, was that he wanted to see what was outside the fence. He wanted to understand this country that had killed his brother and then handed him a wool coat and a cup of real coffee. The Henderson farm was 4 miles east of Camp Herne. It was a cattle ranch first and a cotton operation second, run by a 60-year-old widow named Dorothy Henderson, whose husband had died of a heart attack in 1941 and whose 2 sons were both serving in the Pacific. Dorothy needed help. The Army needed somewhere to send the prisoners. The arrangement was practical, not sentimental, but practical arrangements have a way of becoming something else when human beings are involved. The first time Friedrich brought a work detail to the Henderson farm, Dorothy Henderson was standing on the porch of her farmhouse with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a line so thin it could have been drawn with a pencil. She looked at the German prisoners the way a woman looks at a stain on her good tablecloth. Not with hatred, with inconvenience. She pointed to the fence line that needed mending, said, "Start there," and went back inside. The prisoners worked through the morning. The sun climbed higher. The Texas heat, even in winter, had a dry intensity that sucked the moisture from a man's skin. By noon, the men were tired and thirsty and quiet. Then Dorothy Henderson came out of her farmhouse carrying a wooden tray. On the tray were plates. On the plates was food. Beef, slow-cooked tender, falling apart, seasoned with something smoky and sweet that Friedrich had never tasted before. Next to the beef, cornbread, golden crumbling, still warm from the oven. Red beans cooked with onion and salt pork. And tall glasses of iced tea, sweet enough to make a man's teeth ache, but cold enough to make him close his eyes in gratitude. But it was not the food that stopped Friedrich. It was the table. Dorothy had set up a folding table in the yard, and she had covered it with a cloth, a real cloth, white with small blue flowers embroidered along the edges. She had laid out plates and forks and napkins for prisoners of war, for the enemy. No regulation required this. No order demanded it. She simply chose to feed them like guests instead of labor. Eric sat down at that table and took his first bite of Texas beef, and tears ran down his face. He did not make a sound. He just chewed and cried and chewed and cried, and nobody said anything because every man at that table understood. It was not about the food. It was about being treated like a person. Eric was 19 years old, and he had not been treated like a person in so long that the simple act of sitting at a table with a cloth and a napkin broke something open inside him that he had been holding shut since the day they put a helmet on his head and a rifle in his hands. Otto Langner did not sit at the table. He stood under a live oak tree 30 feet away, his back to the group, his arms rigid at his sides. When Friedrich walked over and asked him to eat, Otto answered without turning around. My sister did not have a last meal. She died under the rubble in Hamburg. The Americans dropped their bombs at 1 in the morning. Lotte was 23 years old. She loved music. She played the violin. Silence. Do not talk to me about tables and tablecloths, Fritz. Friedrich stood beside Otto for a long moment. He did not argue. He did not offer comfort. He simply stood there, two men under a Texas tree, both carrying the weight of someone they had lost. And for the first time, Friedrich understood something about Otto that changed the shape of everything that would come after. Otto was not cruel because he enjoyed cruelty. Otto was cruel because cruelty was the only armor he had against the grief of losing Lotte. If Otto allowed himself to see the Americans as human, then the people who killed his sister were human. And if they were human, then Lotte's death was not the act of a faceless, evil machine. It was a choice made by people who could have chosen differently. That was unbearable, so Otto chose to see them as monsters because monsters are easier to hate than men. Friedrich walked back to the table. He sat down. He ate. But the food tasted different now. Everything tasted different now. That evening back in camp, Friedrich sat on his bunk and tried to rebuild his wall. He closed his eyes and summoned Helmut. The road in Tunisia, the blood on the sand, the lie about pain. But for the first time, the memory did not produce the clean, sharp hatred it once had. Instead, it produced a question. A small, poisonous, unavoidable question that slipped through the crack Jimmy Dawson had made. If Helmut had survived and been captured, would he have wanted someone to set a table for him? Friedrich opened his eyes, stared at the ceiling, and said nothing. The weeks turned. December became January. January became February. The war in Europe was grinding toward its conclusion, and everyone in Camp Hearn knew it, though they processed the knowledge in different ways. The optimists among the prisoners hoped for a quick end and a swift return home. The pessimists feared what a defeated Germany would look like. And Otto Langner's loyalists clung tighter to their pride because pride was the only currency that had not been devalued by the obvious reality that Germany was losing. In January 1944, the American military began expanding what they called the Intellectual Diversion Program at Camp Hearn. The program was designed to expose German prisoners to democratic ideas through indirect means. A library was established stocked with books in German and English. Language classes were offered. American films were screened in the mess hall on Saturday evenings, and a special newspaper printed in German by the Americans called Der Ruf was distributed weekly. The paper carried news of the war, but also articles about American history, democratic institutions, and the rights of individuals. Hal Dawson was tasked with supporting the program at Camp Hearn. He was not an educator, he was a cattleman, but he understood something that many of the program's architects in Washington did not. You cannot force a man to change his mind, he told the program officer who visited the camp. You show him the truth and you let him sit with it. That is all you can do. Forcing just makes them dig in harder. Fritz observed the program with the divided mind of a man at war with himself. The teacher in him, the man who had stood in front of a classroom in Dresden and taught students to think critically about the past, was drawn to the library, to the books, to the conversations that were beginning to happen in quiet corners of the camp. But the brother in him, the man who had held Helmut while he bled out on a desert road, recoiled from every American overture like a hand pulling back from a flame. He compromised by telling himself he was gathering intelligence. He read the American newspapers to understand the enemy. He listened to the English classes through the wall of the barracks to learn the language of his captors. He was not softening, he was studying. That is what he told himself. And for a while he almost believed it. Eric Volk did not have Fritz's gift for self-deception. Eric simply followed his nature, and his nature was music. When the camp library received a small collection of sheet music, Eric's eyes lit up in a way that Fritz had not seen since they boarded the transport ship. When a group of prisoners formed an informal orchestra using instruments provided by the Red Cross, Eric joined immediately. And when Dorothy Henderson, during one of the farm work details, offered to lend the prisoners an old guitar that had belonged to her late husband Eric, accepted it with both hands in a gratitude so naked that even the hardest men in the work detail looked away. Every afternoon after the work was done, Eric sat under the live oak tree at the Henderson farm and played. He played German folk songs, he played Bach, he played Schubert, and then one afternoon he played something new. A melody that rolled and swelled like the landscape around him, wide and open and aching with a loneliness that seemed to belong to the land itself. It was Shenandoah, an American song. He had learned it from one of the farm workers who whistled it while mending fence. The sound carried across the field. German prisoners stopped working and listened. Dorothy Henderson came out onto her porch and stood there with her hand over her mouth. And Friedrich, who was standing by the gate counting heads for the return march, felt something move inside his chest that he could not name and could not stop. Otto Langner heard about the guitar. He heard about Shenandoah, and he acted. The summons came at midnight. Eric was pulled from his bunk by two of Otto's men and taken to the storage shed behind Barracks 4. Inside, 15 prisoners sat in 2 rows, their faces lit by a single kerosene lamp. Otto stood at the front, hands clasped behind his back, his shadow thrown long and sharp against the wall. The charge was collaboration with the enemy. The evidence was the English classes, the guitar, the American song, the easy smile Eric wore when he spoke to the farm workers, the way he said thank you in English to Dorothy Henderson when she brought water. Each small act, innocent on its own, was woven together into a rope, and Otto wrapped that rope around Eric's neck with the precision of a man who had done this before. The sentence was Coventry, total isolation. No prisoner would speak to Eric. No prisoner would sit near him. No prisoner would acknowledge his existence. In the closed world of a prison camp, where a man's only society was his fellow prisoners, Coventry was not just punishment. It was erasure. It was being made into a ghost while still breathing. Eric stood before the tribunal with his arms at his sides and his eyes on the ground. He tried to speak once. I only played music. Music does not have a nationality. Otto's reply was immediate. Everything has a nationality in war. The next morning, Friedrich saw Eric sitting alone at a table in the mess hall. The tables around him were full. The bench beside him was empty. Men walked past without looking at him. Eric sat with his tray in front of him, not eating, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Friedrich stood in the doorway of the mess hall holding his own tray and felt the ground shift beneath him. This was the moment. He could sit somewhere else. He could look away. He could protect himself by doing nothing. That was the safe choice. That was the choice that kept you alive in places like this. Friedrich walked across the mess hall and sat down next to Eric. The sound of his tray hitting the table was the loudest sound in the room. Every man in the hall heard it. Every man understood what it meant. Friedrich Eckhart had chosen a side. Eric looked up. His eyes were red. He did not speak. Friedrich did not speak either. They ate in silence, 2 men on an island surrounded by a sea of turned backs and averted eyes. It was the smallest act of defiance imaginable, and it changed everything. Within hours, Otto knew. Within a day, Friedrich felt the chill. Men who had spoken to him freely now gave short answers or none at all. His bunk area was left conspicuously clean, as if proximity to his belongings might be contaminating. The message was clear. Friedrich was no longer neutral. Friedrich was with the traitor. Friedrich needed a strategy. A direct confrontation with Otto would be futile. Otto outranked him. Otto had numbers. Otto had the loyalty of men who were held together not by affection, but by fear and grief, and the desperate need to believe that their suffering had meaning. Friedrich could not fight that head-on. So he went to Hal Dawson. It was the first time Friedrich had sought Hal out for anything other than official business. He stood in Hal's office with his cap in his hands and asked a question that cost him more pride than he would ever admit. Under the Geneva Convention, can you intervene in internal prisoner discipline? Hal leaned back in his chair. On paper, no. Internal discipline is the responsibility of the senior prisoner officer. That would be Langner, since he outranks you. But if there is physical violence, I am required to step in. There is no physical violence, only silence. Hal looked at Friedrich for a long time. His eyes were tired, the eyes of a man who had been carrying weight for longer than his body was designed to carry it. Silence can kill a man just as dead as a bullet, Eckhart. But the army does not have a regulation for silence. Friedrich nodded, he turned to leave, and then Hal said something that stopped him at the door. My son wrote a letter the night before he died. I have not opened it. 3 months now. Friedrich turned back. Why not? Hal's voice was low, almost a whisper. Because I am afraid. If Jimmy wrote that he was scared, that he was in pain, that he blamed me for not stopping him from enlisting, I cannot live with that. Friedrich understood that fear. He understood it in his bones. Because Helmut had said, I am not in pain. And Friedrich had known it was a lie and had accepted the lie because the truth was too heavy to hold. He looked at Hal Dawson and saw for the first time, not an American. Not the enemy, not the representative of the nation that had killed his brother. He saw a father who was terrified of his own son's last words. Sometimes, Friedrich said, choosing each word carefully, the letters we are most afraid to read are the ones we need the most. Hal said nothing. Friedrich left. That night, Friedrich made his move. He requested that Hal transfer Eric to an external work detail at the Henderson farm on a permanent basis, citing the need for additional labor. The real reason was simple. Outside the camp fence, Otto's Coventry order had no power. Eric would spend his days among American farmers and prisoners from other compounds who were not under Otto's control. He would eat meals at Dorothy Henderson's table. He would play the guitar under the live oak tree. He would breathe. Hal approved the transfer without asking questions. He understood. Otto found out within 2 days. He did not rage. He did not threaten. He simply appeared beside Friedrich one evening as Friedrich was walking back from the wash house and fell into step beside him as if they were old friends taking a stroll. You are protecting a traitor, Fritz. What does that say about you? It says that I do not let a 19-year-old boy be destroyed for playing music. Otto stopped walking. Friedrich stopped too. They faced each other in the narrow space between barracks. The last light of the Texas sun turning the dust around their feet into something that looked almost like gold. My sister was 19 when the Americans killed her. Otto's voice was different now. Not commanding, not cold, raw. She loved music. She played the violin. Did I tell you that? You told me. Then do not speak to me about 19-year-old children and music. You do not have the right. Friedrich looked at Otto and saw the truth of him laid bare. This was not a man who wanted power. This was a man who wanted his sister back. And because he could not have her back, he wanted the world to hurt as much as he did. Every act of kindness that an American showed a German prisoner was to Otto a personal insult, because it suggested that the people who burned Hamburg and killed Lotte were capable of goodness. And if they were capable of goodness, then the bombing was not the act of evil men. It was the act of complicated men who made terrible choices. And that was so much worse, because evil can be hated simply. Complexity cannot. Friedrich said nothing. There was nothing to say. He turned and walked to his barracks and lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling, and for the first time since arriving at Camp Hearn, he did not think about Helmut. He thought about Lotte, a 23-year-old girl with a violin buried under the rubble of her own apartment, killed by bombs dropped from planes flown by men who probably had sisters of their own. The war had no clean lines. It never did. That night at 2 in the morning, Friedrich got out of bed. He could not sleep. He walked outside into the cold Texas air and found himself standing in front of the barracks where Eric slept. He stood at the door and thought about what would happen if he simply stopped, if he withdrew his protection, if he let Otto have Eric. Life would become easier immediately. Otto would leave him alone. The other prisoners would speak to him again. He could spend the rest of the war in quiet, anonymous captivity, hating America in peace. mourning Helmut in peace, waiting for the end. All he had to do was walk away, turn his back on a frightened 19-year-old boy who played the cello and cried when a Texas widow put a tablecloth on a folding table. Friedrich stood at that door for 60 seconds. It was the longest minute of his life. Every reason to walk away was rational. Every reason to stay was not. Staying meant more isolation, more risk, more of Otto's cold attention. Staying meant choosing a boy he barely knew over his own safety, his own comfort, his own peace. He thought about Dorothy Henderson setting out plates for prisoners of war. She did not have to do that. No rule required it. She chose to treat them as human beings because that was who she was. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe, because it was right. Friedrich turned around, walked back to his bunk, lay down, closed his eyes. He would not walk away. Not because he loved America, not because he had forgiven the people who killed Helmut, but because he did not want to become Otto. He did not want to be a man whose pain made every decision for him. He wanted to be the kind of man who could stand at a door at 2 in the morning and choose the harder thing. He did not know that Otto had watched him from the shadows of Barracks 4. He did not know that Otto had seen him standing at Eric's door and had drawn the wrong conclusion. Otto believed Friedrich had gone outside to make secret contact with the American guards. From that night forward in Otto's mind, Friedrich was no longer a disagreeable colleague. He was a traitor. And traitors in Otto's world had only one destination. 3 weeks later, the second tribunal came. This time it was not just for Eric, it was for Friedrich too. The charge was systematic collaboration with the enemy. The evidence was Friedrich's meetings with Hal Dawson, his transfer request for Eric, his refusal to sign the Hearn Oath, his nighttime movements. Woven together, these ordinary acts became a narrative of betrayal, and Otto presented it with the calm authority of a prosecutor who has already decided the verdict. The sentence was not Coventry this time. It was something older and darker. Otto called it Heilige Gericht, holy judgment. The words were a euphemism for what happened next in places where officers loyal to the old cause held power over men who had lost the will to resist. Friedrich had heard stories from other camps. Broken ribs, shattered jaws. Men found in the morning with injuries that were reported as falls from bunks. Friedrich learned of the tribunal from Walter Bruck, a 40-year-old former baker from Munich, who had been at another camp before his transfer to Hearn. Walter had witnessed a Heilige Gericht once. They beat a man until he could not stand. The Americans found him the next morning with 4 broken ribs. The official report said he fell out of bed. Walter's hands were shaking as he spoke. "Fritz, they mean to hurt you and the boy." Tonight. Friedrich did not hesitate. He went to Hal's office. It was 10 at night. He knocked on the door. When Hal opened it, Friedrich stood in the yellow light of the doorway and said words that no German officer should ever say to an enemy captor. He reported his own countrymen. He told Hal about the tribunal, about the Heilige Gericht, about what would happen to Eric if no one intervened. Hal listened without interrupting. When Friedrich finished, Hal asked one question. "You understand that if I act on this, every man in that camp will know you are the one who reported it?" "I understand. And you are standing here anyway." "I am standing here." Hal reached for his hat. He called Ray Cutler and a squad of guards. They moved through the camp, in the dark boots quiet on the dirt paths, flashlights off until they reached the storage shed behind Barracks 4. Hal opened the door. The scene inside was exactly what Friedrich had described. 15 men seated in rows, a kerosene lamp throwing shadows, Otto at the front, hands behind his back, voice mid-sentence, and Eric on his knees on the dirt floor, his face already bruised, blood running from a cut above his left eye. They had started before the Americans arrived. Hal's voice filled the shed like cold water. "Everyone back to your bunks, now. Langner, you are coming with me." The tribunal dissolved. Men filed out in silence, most of them unable to meet Hal's eyes or Friedrich's. Otto walked past Friedrich without looking at him, but as he passed, he said 3 words so quietly that only Friedrich could hear them. "You chose them." Otto was placed in solitary confinement. Eric was taken to the camp infirmary, where a medic cleaned the cut above his eye and checked for broken bones. There were none, but the bruising on his ribs suggested that the beating had been underway for several minutes before the guards arrived. Friedrich walked back to his barracks alone. The compound was quiet now, the kind of quiet that follows a storm, not peaceful but stunned. He pushed open the door to his section and walked to his bunk. On his pillow, someone had placed a small piece of paper. One word written in pencil. Verrater. Traitor. Friedrich picked up the paper, looked at it, folded it once, then twice, then placed it in his pocket. He would keep that piece of paper for the rest of his life. Not as a wound, as a reminder. A reminder that doing the right thing and doing the easy thing are almost never the same thing. And that the people who call you a traitor for choosing mercy over loyalty are usually the people most in need of mercy themselves. He lay down on his bunk, closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, Friedrich Eckhart slept through the night without dreaming of Helmut. Something had changed, not the grief would never leave. But the grief was no longer the only thing inside him. There was something else now, something small and stubborn, like a seed that has found a crack in concrete and decided to grow anyway. He did not have a name for it yet, but it was there. And what happened on the night of March 14th, 1945, would test that unnamed thing to its absolute limit, because Otto Langner was not finished, not even close. And the fire that was coming would force every man in Camp Hearn, American and German alike, to decide who they truly were when the world was burning around them. That night was still weeks away, but it was coming, and nothing could stop it. Otto Langner was transferred to a separate compound after the tribunal raid. The Americans placed him in a section reserved for what they quietly called the hard cases prisoners, whose loyalty to the old regime made them dangerous to other Germans more than to the guards themselves. Behind a second layer of fence watched by an additional rotation of sentries, Otto was supposed to be neutralized, contained, forgotten. But containment is an illusion when the thing you are trying to contain lives inside the minds of men who still believe. Otto's loyalists remained in Compound B. They were quieter now, more careful, but their network did not dissolve. It simply went underground. Messages moved through the camp in ways the Americans did not anticipate. Notes folded into the spines of library books. Words scratched into the undersides of mess trays. Signals passed during the morning head count, a cough here, a shifted foot there, a vocabulary of resistance so subtle that even the most observant guard would see nothing but men standing in formation. Otto's plan took shape slowly over weeks, carried from compound to compound, by men who believed they were soldiers still fighting a war that the rest of the world had already decided was lost. But before the fire, before the night that would divide Camp Hearn into before and after, there was a stretch of days that Friedrich would remember as the closest thing to peace he had experienced since the war began. After Otto's removal, the atmosphere in Compound B shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, but the way a landscape changes after a storm passes. The air felt different. Men who had been afraid to speak began to speak. Men who had avoided Eric began to nod at him in the mess hall, small gestures that cost nothing but meant everything. The Coventry was not officially lifted because there was no one left with the authority to lift it. It simply evaporated the way fear evaporates when the source of fear is removed from the room. Friedrich and Eric fell into a rhythm. In the mornings, they worked at the Henderson farm. In the afternoons, they sat outside the barracks, and Friedrich did what he had done before the war turned him into a soldier. He taught. He told Eric about the Roman Empire, about the Renaissance, about the Enlightenment, about the revolutions that had reshaped Europe over centuries. He talked about how nations rise and fall, how empires that seem invincible crumble from within, how the most dangerous idea in history is the idea that one group of people is inherently superior to another. Eric listened the way only a 19-year-old can listen, with his whole body leaning forward, eyes wide, absorbing everything. And in return, Eric taught Friedrich to hear music. Not just listen to it, but hear it. He explained how a melody works, how tension builds through dissonance and resolves through harmony, how the silence between notes is as important as the notes themselves. He played Bach on Dorothy Henderson's guitar, translating compositions written for keyboard into something that could live on 6 strings, and Friedrich sat beside him and felt the music move through the Texas air like a living thing, warm and precise, and utterly indifferent to the barbed wire that surrounded them. Hal Dawson watched from his office window. He saw Fritz and Eric sitting together in the late afternoon light, one man talking, the other playing, and he thought about Jimmy. Jimmy used to sit on the porch of their farmhouse and tell stories to anyone who would listen. He had that gift, the gift of making people lean in. Hal had not thought about that particular memory in months. He had trained himself not to think about the specific things, the details, because the details were where the pain lived. But watching Fritz and Eric, he could not stop the memory from surfacing. Margaret noticed the change in her husband, not a dramatic change. Hal was not a dramatic man. But she noticed that he came home from the camp a few minutes later each evening as if he were finding reasons to stay. She noticed that he mentioned the German officer Eckhart more often than he mentioned any other prisoner. And one evening while they were sitting on the porch after dinner, she noticed that Hal was holding an envelope. The envelope. The one that had been in his desk drawer for months. "Are you going to open it?" she asked. "I do not know. Jimmy wrote it for you, Hal. Whatever is in there, he wanted you to have it." Hal turned the envelope over in his hands. The paper was worn soft from all the times he had picked it up and put it back down. Jimmy's handwriting on the front, the loose, confident letters of a young man who had not yet learned to be afraid of the future. Hal ran his thumb across the ink and felt his son's hand in the movement of each letter. He did not open it that night, but he brought it home. And that was a step, February 1945. The news that reached Camp Hearn was relentless and unforgiving. The Red Army was pushing into Germany from the east, grinding through villages and cities with a momentum that nothing could stop. From the west, the Allies advanced with equal determination. Germany was being compressed, squeezed from both sides, and every prisoner in Camp Hearn could feel the end approaching the way a man standing on railroad tracks can feel the vibration of a train that has not yet appeared around the bend. And then came the news about Dresden. February 13th and 14th, 1945. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces launched a series of bombing raids on the city of Dresden that created a firestorm so intense it generated its own weather system. Winds of hurricane force pulled oxygen from the streets and fed the flames that consumed the city center. The exact number of dead has been debated by historians for decades, but the scale of destruction was beyond dispute. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. Churches, hospitals, schools, homes, all of it reduced to ash and rubble and silence. Dresden was Friedrich's home. He heard the news from a guard who mentioned it casually while distributing the morning newspaper. The guard did not know that the prisoner standing in front of him had grown up on a street that no longer existed, had taught in a school that was now a pile of blackened stone, had a mother whose address was somewhere in the heart of the firestorm. Friedrich took the newspaper to his bunk. He read the article twice. Then he put the newspaper down, lay on his side, and did not move for 3 days. He did not eat. He did not speak. He did not go to the Henderson farm. He did not sit with Eric. He lay on his bunk and stared at the wooden walls 6 inches from his face and tried to imagine what his mother's street looked like now. Eric brought him food. Friedrich did not touch it. Eric brought him water. Friedrich drank a little, then turned away. Eric sat on the floor next to Friedrich's bunk and played the guitar so softly that the notes were barely louder than breathing. He played for an hour, then 2, then 3. He did not ask Friedrich to speak. He did not ask Friedrich to eat. He simply sat there and filled the silence with the only thing he had to offer. On the second day, Hal came to the barracks. He stood at the foot of Friedrich's bunk and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "We are trying to get information about civilian casualties and survivors through the Red Cross. It may take weeks, but we are trying." Friedrich did not respond. Hal nodded as if silence were an acceptable answer and left. On the third day, Friedrich sat up. His face was gray, his eyes were hollow, but he was upright. Eric was still there, sitting on the floor, guitar across his lap. "My mother lives on Bergstrasse," Friedrich said. His voice was raw, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep and reluctant. "Third floor. Blue curtains in the window." "She may have evacuated," Eric said. "Many people left before the bombing." "She may have." "She may be alive, Fritz." Friedrich looked at Eric. The boy's face was earnest and hopeful and impossibly young. Friedrich wanted to believe him. Wanting to believe was the first thing he had felt in 3 days. It was on the third evening, with Friedrich still fragile and the compound still subdued by the news from Dresden, that Hal Dawson sat down at his desk and opened Jimmy's letter. He was alone in his office. The door was closed. The lamp was on. Outside, the Texas night was doing what Texas nights do in February, cold and clear, and full of stars that looked close enough to touch. Hal picked up the envelope. He did not hesitate this time. He slid his thumb under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper folded in thirds covered on both sides with Jimmy's handwriting. The letter was dated the night before the artillery barrage at El Gueter. "Dear Dad," it began, "today I bandaged a German officer who was hit in the shoulder. He spat in my face. I am not angry. I keep thinking about what you told me when I was 12 and Bobby Macklin broke my nose in the schoolyard. You said the way you treat people when you have the power, that is who you really are. I have been trying to live by that over here. It is not always easy, but I think it matters. The German officer lost his brother a few weeks ago. I heard from the translators. His brother was killed in one of our airstrikes on a supply convoy. I think about that. If someone killed you or Mom, I do not know what I would do. I hope I would still be the person you raised me to be, but I am not sure. Nobody is sure about that until they are tested. Dad, I want to come home. I want to eat Mom's pecan pie and sit on the porch and listen to you complain about the cattle prices. I want to take a girl to the pictures and drive too fast on the back roads and do all the stupid, wonderful, ordinary things that I did not know were precious until I came here and they were gone. But if I do not come home, I need you to know something. I am not afraid. I am not in pain. I am your son, and I tried to be the man you taught me to be. And if the worst happens, please do not carry it like a stone around your neck. Live, Dad. Be kind. That is all I ask. I love you. Tell Mom I love her too. I will write again tomorrow." There was no tomorrow. The shell landed at 0600 the next morning. Hal read the letter. He read it again. He folded it carefully along the original creases and held it against his chest. And Harold Dawson, a man who had not cried since the day they told him Jimmy was gone, a man who had held his grief behind a wall of duty and discipline and the daily mechanics of running a prison camp, put his head down on his desk and wept. He wept for 10 minutes. He wept for every morning he had counted German prisoners and thought about his son, who would never be counted again. He wept for every letter Margaret had hidden from him to spare his feelings. He wept for every time he had looked at Friedrich Eckhart and seen the man who spat in his son's face and had to choose every single day between hatred and the principles that Jimmy had died believing in. When it was over, Hal washed his face, put on his hat, walked across the compound in the dark, and knocked on the door of Friedrich's barracks. Friedrich was sitting on his bunk awake. He had not been sleeping well since Dresden. Hal stood in the doorway and held out the letter. "Read this." Friedrich took the letter. His English had improved enough over the months through the classes he attended, while pretending not to attend them through the newspapers he read, while telling himself he was only studying the enemy. He read Jimmy's words, slowly moving his lips slightly, and when he reached the part about the German officer who had lost his brother, he stopped. He read that passage 3 times. Then he continued to the end. When he finished, he folded the letter and held it out to Hal. The two men looked at each other across a distance that was measured not in feet, but in everything that had happened since a young American soldier knelt on a dusty road in Tunisia and chose to bandage the wound of a man who would spit in his face. "Your son was a good man," Friedrich said. "My son believed you were too. I am still deciding." "So am I." Hal took the letter back. He paused in the doorway. "Eckhart, the Red Cross report came through. Your mother evacuated Dresden 3 weeks before the bombing. She is alive. She is in a refugee shelter in Bavaria." Friedrich closed his eyes. His hands began to tremble. He pressed them flat against his knees to make them stop. It did not work. He pressed harder. The trembling traveled up his arms and into his chest, and then his whole body was shaking, not with cold, not with fear, but with the particular convulsion of a man who has been bracing for the worst and has been given against all expectation something other than the worst. "Thank you," he said. The words were barely audible. Hal nodded once. Then he was gone. That night in the darkness of a Texas barracks, with coyotes singing their ancient indifferent songs across the flatland, Friedrich Eckhart held the knowledge that his mother was alive and that Jimmy Dawson's last letter had called him worthy of compassion. 2 truths that should not exist in the same world as the death of Helmut and the bombing of Dresden and the barbed wire fence outside his window. But they did exist. All of it existed simultaneously, The cruelty and the kindness, the bombs and the bandages, the hatred in the tablecloth with blue flowers on a folding table in a Texas farmyard. And Friedrich understood, for the first time, that the world was not divided into enemies and allies. It was divided into people who let their pain make their choices for them and people who chose despite their pain. He knew which one he wanted to be. He was not yet sure he was strong enough. He would find out soon. Otto Langner had been planning for 6 weeks, from his solitary compound communicating through the book code and the mess tray signals and the cough language of men who refused to surrender even in captivity. He had assembled a plan that was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its intent. The plan was not escape. Otto knew that escape from a camp in the middle of Texas was fantasy. There was nowhere to go. A German soldier in prisoner clothing would be spotted within hours on the open prairie. The plan was something more strategic. Otto intended to stage a riot so violent, so destructive, that the American military would be forced to conclude that the re-education program was a failure, that German prisoners could not be civilized, that the only option was harsher camps, stricter controls, a return to the kind of imprisonment where men like Otto held all the power because fear was the only currency. The riot would accomplish one more thing. In the chaos when the guards were occupied and the compound was dark and full of smoke, Otto's men would find Friedrich Eckhart, and they would deliver the Heilige Gericht that had been interrupted. March 14th, 1945. The night was moonless. A wind had been blowing since afternoon, carrying dust and the smell of distant rain. At 2 in the morning, a fire erupted in Barracks 3. Not an accident. Kerosene from the storage shed spread along the base of the walls, ignited by a match struck in the darkness by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. The fire moved fast. Wood and wind and kerosene made a combination that turned a building into a torch in under 3 minutes. Then a second barracks caught. Then a third. Men poured out of the buildings in confusion and terror, some in their underclothes, some barefoot, all of them disoriented by smoke and shouting and the animal panic that fire produces in every human being, regardless of nationality or training. Otto's men moved through the chaos with purpose. They overturned tables in the mess hall. They broke windows. They set a fourth fire near the administration building. The goal was maximum disorder, maximum confusion, maximum proof that German prisoners were ungovernable. Ray Cutler was on watch in the North Tower when the first flame appeared. He was down the ladder and running toward the compound before the alarm siren had finished its first rotation. He arrived at the gate with his rifle in his hands and his heart beating so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Through the fence, he saw what looked like the end of the world. Fire, smoke, shadows running in every direction. German voices screaming commands and counter-commands. Ray chambered around. His training told him to hold position and wait for reinforcement. His body told him that the men inside that fence were the enemy, and the enemy was destroying his camp. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where Danny still lived, a voice said, "Let them burn." He did not listen to that voice. He opened the gate and went in. Friedrich woke to the smell of smoke. Not the gentle smoke of a wood stove or a campfire, but the thick chemical smell of kerosene accelerant consuming dry timber. He rolled out of his bunk and hit the floor just as the window above him shattered from the heat of the adjacent barracks. Glass rained down on his back. He covered his head, crawled to the door, and pushed it open. The compound was a scene from a nightmare painted in orange and black. 3 barracks were fully engulfed. Men were everywhere, running, stumbling, shouting. Friedrich could not tell who was rioting and who was fleeing. In firelight, all men looked the same. His first thought was Eric. He ran to Eric's barracks. The building was intact, but empty. The bunks were thrown aside. Eric was not there. Friedrich ran back into the smoke, calling Eric's name, his voice lost in the roar of the fire and the crack of collapsing beams. He found Eric behind the storage shed. The boy was on the ground, curled on his side, his arms wrapped around his head. A bruise was already forming on his temple. One of Otto's men had gotten to him first. Friedrich knelt down. "Eric, Eric, can you hear me?" Eric's eyes opened, unfocused, terrified. "Fritz, I am here. Can you stand?" "I think so." Friedrich pulled Eric to his feet. The boy swayed. Friedrich put Eric's arm over his shoulder and began moving toward the eastern fence, away from the worst of the fire. And then he heard a voice behind him. "You chose them, Fritz." Otto Langner stood 10 feet away. He had gotten out. The fire had damaged the fence between compounds, and Otto had walked through the gap like a man walking through a door that had been left open for him by fate. He held a broken piece of timber in his right hand. His face was lit by the glow of the burning barracks, and in that light his eyes were not angry. They were empty. The eyes of a man who has burned through every emotion and arrived at a place beyond feeling. You chose them over us, Otto said again. Over Germany. Over Lotte. Friedrich lowered Eric gently to the ground and stood up straight. He faced Otto across 10 feet of dirt and smoke, and 60 years of history that neither of them had asked to carry. I chose not to let you kill a boy, Otto. That is not choosing a country. That is choosing to be a human being. Otto raised the timber. Friedrich did not move. He did not raise his hands. He did not step back. He stood and waited because he understood something about Otto that Otto did not understand about himself. Otto did not want to hit Friedrich. Otto wanted someone to stop him. Otto had been wanting someone to stop him since the night Lotte died and no one had, and so he had kept going, kept hurting, kept building his fortress of grief higher and higher until he was trapped inside it. Otto held the timber above his head. His arms shook. The fire roared behind him. Eric lay on the ground barely conscious, and for 5 seconds the entire compound held its breath. Then Otto saw it. Friedrich standing over Eric, shielding him. An older man protecting a younger one. A brother protecting a brother. The image hit Otto like a physical blow, because he had stood exactly like that once. Over Lotte. When she was small and the neighbor's dog had chased her and Otto, 15 years old, had put himself between his sister and the animal and said, "You will not touch her." The timber came down, not on Friedrich's head, on the ground. Otto dropped it and his arms fell to his sides, and he stood there breathing hard, looking at Friedrich and Eric with an expression that was not surrender and not defeat, but something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a weight too heavy for any human being to carry and who has in this moment simply run out of the strength to hold it. And then Ray Cutler arrived, running through the smoke rifle raised, shouting at Otto to get on the ground. Otto looked at Ray, looked at the rifle, then lowered himself to his knees and put his hands behind his head. Not because he was afraid, because he was finished. Ray secured Otto with zip ties. Then he turned and saw Friedrich still standing over Eric. And in that moment, a group of Otto's loyalists came running around the corner of the burning storage shed, moving toward Friedrich, with the momentum of men who have committed to violence and cannot stop themselves. Friedrich stepped forward. He raised his right hand toward Ray and the rifle. He raised his left hand toward the oncoming prisoners. This was the moment from the beginning, the moment the story had been building toward since the first second. Friedrich shouted in German, "Stop! The war is almost over. Look at what you are doing. You are burning your own home." He shouted in English, "Do not shoot. They are afraid. They are only afraid." The running men slowed, stopped. They looked at Friedrich, standing between two worlds belonging to neither, choosing both. They looked at the fire behind them, and the rifles in front of them, and the 19-year-old boy on the ground, and the kneeling figure of Otto Langner, and something in the configuration of all these things, the geometry of this single moment, broke through the last wall of ideology and rage and grief. They stopped. Ray Cutler did not shoot. The compound went quiet. The only sound was the fire consuming what was left of the barracks, with a patience that felt almost peaceful, the way destruction sometimes does when it has finished its work and is simply burning itself out. Hal Dawson arrived with a full squad of reinforcements 2 minutes later. By then the riot was over. The loyalists had dispersed. Otto was in custody, the wounded were being collected, and Friedrich Eckhart was still standing in the same spot, his arms still raised, because his body had not yet received the message that the danger had passed. Hal walked up to him, looked at him, and said in a voice that carried no more weight than a man commenting on the weather, "Go take care of your people, Eckhart." Friedrich lowered his arms. His legs buckled for a moment, then held. He turned around, knelt beside Eric, and lifted the boy into his arms. Eric was conscious but dazed, his head lolling against Friedrich's shoulder like a child who has fallen asleep in the car. As Friedrich carried Eric toward the infirmary, he passed Ray Cutler. Ray was standing very still, his rifle lowered, watching Friedrich carry the boy through the smoke. And on Ray's face was an expression that Friedrich did not see because he was not looking. But if he had looked, he would have seen recognition. Not of Friedrich specifically, but of the act. A man carrying someone he loved through danger. A brother carrying a brother. Ray Cutler had been told that his son Danny died at Anzio carrying a wounded friend to the aid station. Danny was hit by a second round while his friend was still on his back. He fell and his friend fell with him, and when the medics arrived, Danny's arms were still wrapped around his companion. Ray watched Friedrich disappear into the smoke with Eric on his shoulder. And for the first time in 14 months, the wall inside Ray Cutler cracked. Not broke. Cracked. A hairline fracture invisible from the outside, but enough to let in a thin, painful sliver of something other than hatred. He did not speak. He did not cry. He simply stood in the dying firelight and breathed. May 8th, 1945. Germany surrendered. The news arrived at Camp Herne by radio, and for a long moment no one in the compound moved. Then slowly reactions emerged. Some men wept. Some sat in silence. Some shook their heads and stared at the ground as if looking for something they had lost. Friedrich stood outside his barracks and looked up at the Texas sky and thought about his mother in Bavaria, about Helmut in the ground in Tunisia, about the school in Dresden that was now rubble, about the life he had lived before the war that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Eric stood beside him. The bruise on his temple had faded to a yellow shadow. He was holding Dorothy Henderson's guitar. "What happens now?" Eric asked. "We go home," Friedrich said. "Whatever home means now." The repatriation process began in the summer of 1945. Prisoners were classified. Those deemed to be hardcore Nazis were held longer or transferred to British or French custody. Those who had shown willingness to engage with the re-education program were prioritized for early return. Friedrich, because of his actions during the riot and his cooperation with the camp administration, was placed in the first group to leave. The morning of his departure was warm, July in Texas. The sun was already high and the air smelled like dry grass and dust and the faint distant sweetness of cattle feed. Friedrich packed his belongings into a small canvas bag. There was not much. A change of clothes, his brother's photograph, the piece of paper that said Verrater, and a folded letter that Hal Dawson had given him the night before. Friedrich walked to the camp gate. Hal was there standing in the shade of the guard tower, wearing his uniform and his hat, and the expression of a man who has learned to say goodbye without letting it destroy him. They shook hands. It was the first time in nearly 2 years that they had touched as equals, not as prisoner and captor, not as enemy and guard, as two men who had lost sons and brothers and pieces of themselves that they would never get back, and who had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, found in each other a reflection of the thing they valued most: decency. Hal handed Friedrich a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was Margaret's handwritten barbecue sauce recipe, a photograph of Camp Herne taken from the guard tower, and Jimmy's last letter. "I cannot take this," Friedrich said. "This belongs to you. Jimmy wrote that letter because of you. It belongs to you as much as it does to me." Friedrich held the package against his chest. He wanted to say something that would capture what this moment meant, something about gratitude and shame and transformation, and the impossible, illogical fact that the worst years of his life had also been the years that taught him who he truly was. But there are no words for that. Not in German, not in English, not in any language ever spoken. "I will write to you," Friedrich said. "I will write back," Hal said. Friedrich turned to Eric. The boy was standing a few feet away, guitar in one hand, notebook in the other, looking exactly like what he was. A 19-year-old kid who had survived something that should have destroyed him and had come out the other side with his music and his kindness intact. They embraced, the embrace of brothers. "You saved my life, Fritz. You do not owe me anything, Eric. You only owe yourself. Keep playing." As Friedrich walked toward the transport truck, he passed Ray Cutler. Ray was standing by the fence, hands at his sides, watching the departing prisoners with the same flat, unreadable expression he wore every day. But when Friedrich drew level with him, Ray did something he had not done in 14 months of guarding German prisoners of war. He nodded. One nod. Small, almost invisible. The kind of gesture that could be missed if you were not looking for it. But Friedrich was looking, and he nodded back. And in that exchange, two men who had every reason in the world to hate each other acknowledged something that neither of them would ever say out loud. That grief does not have a nationality. That loss does not have a uniform. that the distance between enemies is sometimes no wider than the distance between a father and his son. Friedrich climbed into the truck. He did not look back at Camp Hearn. He did not need to. The camp was already inside him, woven into the fabric of who he had become, inseparable from the man who would step off a ship in Hamburg and begin the long, uncertain process of building a life in a country that had been broken and was trying to learn how to stand again. In his pocket was a barbecue recipe, a letter from a dead soldier, and a piece of paper that said traitor. He would keep all three for the rest of his life. 1955. Hamburg, Germany. Friedrich Eckhardt, 39 years old, stood in front of a classroom in a rebuilt school in a rebuilt city and taught history to students who had been born during the war and remembered nothing of it. On the wall behind his desk, he had pinned a photograph of Camp Hearn. None of his students knew what it was. None of them asked, but it was there every day, a reminder that the most important lessons he had ever learned were not in any textbook. Every year on March 14th, Friedrich wrote a letter to Hal Dawson, and every year Hal wrote back. The letters crossed the Atlantic like small ships carrying cargo too precious to name. They wrote about weather and cattle and the price of feed. They wrote about Margaret's health and Friedrich's students and the way the world was changing around them. They never wrote about Jimmy or Helmut directly. They did not need to. The dead were present in every line, in every carefully chosen word, in the simple fact that two men who had met as enemies continued year after year to reach across an ocean and say, "I am still here." 1968, Hearn, Texas. Harold Dawson died at 77. Heart failure, the doctor said, which was technically true and completely inadequate as an explanation. Margaret found a tin box in his closet. Inside were 23 letters from Germany, all from Spat. Eckhardt arranged in chronological order, each one read so many times that the paper had gone soft along the folds. Margaret wrote to Friedrich. Friedrich wrote back. His letter was the longest he had ever composed in English, which was now fluent, and it ended with a sentence that Margaret framed and hung in the hallway of the house she and Hal had shared for 49 years. Mr. Dawson was the first American to show me that honor does not belong to any nation. It belongs to human beings. 1972. West Berlin. Erich Vogt, 48 years old, took the stage at the Berlin Philharmonic as a guest soloist. He was a cellist of growing reputation, known for performances that combined technical precision with an emotional depth that critics described as almost unbearably human. For his encore that evening, he played an arrangement of Shenandoah that he had composed himself, translating the melody from guitar to cello, from a Texas farmyard to a European concert hall, from the soundtrack of one man's transformation into something that belonged to everyone who heard it. In the third row sat Friedrich Eckhardt, 66 years old, silver-haired, wearing a suit that was slightly too large for him because he had never cared much about clothes. When the first notes of Shenandoah filled the hall, Friedrich closed his eyes, and he was back under the live oak tree at the Henderson farm, 28 years old, listening to a frightened boy play an American song on a borrowed guitar while the Texas sun set behind the barbed wire. Nobody else in the concert hall knew why the old man in the third row was crying. Nobody needed to. 1985. Stillwater, Oklahoma. Ray Cutler is 75 years old, sat on the porch of his farmhouse with his grandson, a 12-year-old boy named Danny, after the uncle he had never met. The boy had asked about the war. Boys always ask about the war eventually. Ray was quiet for a long time. Then he told the story. Not all of it, not the worst parts, but he told his grandson about a camp in Texas where German prisoners were kept. He told him about the fire, and he told him about a young German kid not much older than a teenager who played a song called Lily Marlene that his father, the first Danny, used to whistle. "Did you hate the German prisoners, Grandpa?" Ray looked out at the Oklahoma sky. A red-tailed hawk was circling above the cornfield. He watched it for a long time before answering. "Yes, then no, then I did not know anymore. That is what war does to a person, Danny. It makes you sure about things you should not be sure about. And then it takes that sureness away and leaves you with nothing but questions. Is that bad?" Ray considered this. "No," he said finally. "Questions are better than being sure. Being sure is what starts wars. Questions are what ends them." 1989. The Berlin Wall fell. Friedrich Eckhardt, 73 years old, watched it on television from his apartment in Hamburg. He called Eric Vogt, who was conducting a rehearsal in Munich. They spoke for 2 hours. They talked about the wall and about Germany and about the future. And then at the very end of the conversation, Friedrich said, "I am sending Helga to Texas." Helga Eckhart Friedrich's daughter was 38. She was an English teacher in Hamburg. She had grown up hearing fragments of her father's story pieces offered in quiet moments, never the whole thing because the whole thing was too large and too complicated to give to a child all at once. But she knew about Camp Hearn. She knew about Hal Dawson. And she knew about the letter. Helga flew to Texas carrying Jimmy Dawson's letter in her bag. She rented a car at the Houston airport and drove north through the same landscape her father had seen through barred train windows 46 years earlier. Flat land, cattle, wide sky. When she arrived in Hearn, she asked for directions to the Dawson house. Margaret Dawson was 93 years old. She opened the door and saw a woman she had never met holding an envelope she had not seen in over 40 years. The handwriting on the front was Jimmy's. Helga tried to speak. She had prepared a statement in English, something about her father and gratitude and the connection between their families. But when she saw Margaret's face, when she saw the old woman's eyes go wide and then fill with tears at the sight of her son's handwriting, every prepared word evaporated. Margaret reached out and touched the envelope. Her fingers traced the letters of Jimmy's name the way Hal used to trace them decades ago in his office at Camp Hearn. Then Margaret pulled Helga into her arms. Two women who had never spoken, who shared no language beyond the vocabulary of loss and love, and the strange, persistent miracle of human connection across the widest divides, held each other in the doorway of a small house in a small Texas town, and neither of them said a word because there was nothing that words could add to what was already understood. 2019, Camp Hearn, Texas. The camp is a museum now. The barracks are gone, but the foundations remain concrete rectangles in the grass like the footprints of buildings that once held the weight of men's choices. A small visitor center displays photographs, letters, canteen coupons, and artifacts donated by families of former prisoners and guards. A plaque near the entrance reads, Camp Hearn, POW, Camp 1942 to 1945, where enemies became neighbors. On a warm afternoon in October, a young woman of 25 stood in front of that plaque holding a tin box. Her name was Lotte Eckhart. Friedrich had named his granddaughter after Otto Langner's sister, the girl with the violin, who died under the rubble in Hamburg. It was his way of remembering that the pain on the other side is also real, that even the people who hurt us are carrying losses that we cannot see, and that the only way to honor the dead is to refuse to let their deaths make us smaller. Lotte opened the tin box. Inside were 4 items: a handwritten barbecue sauce recipe on a stained index card, the handwriting of a Texas woman named Margaret who believed that enemies deserve tablecloths, a black and white photograph of Camp Hearn taken from the guard tower in 1944, tiny figures visible in the compound below, impossible to tell from that distance whether they were American or German. A letter written by a 22-year-old soldier named Jimmy Dawson the night before he died. A letter that said, "I am not afraid, and be kind, and I am your son, and I tried to be the man you taught me to be." And a small American flag faded almost white that Hal Dawson had pressed into Friedrich's hand on the day he left Camp Hearn, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. Lotte placed the tin box on the windowsill of the visitor center next to a vase of wildflowers that someone had picked that morning from the field outside. She stood there for a while looking at the concrete foundations and the grass, trying to imagine the barracks and the fence and the men who had lived and fought and changed inside them. She could not imagine it fully. No one who was not there can. But she could feel it the way you can feel the warmth of a fire that burned out long ago by putting your hand on the stones that surrounded it. Friedrich Eckhart lived to be 92 years old. He died in 2008 in Hamburg in his sleep in the apartment where he had lived for 40 years. On his bedside table was Jimmy Dawson's letter so worn from reading that the paper had the texture of cloth. His daughter Helga found it the next morning unfolded as if Friedrich had read it one last time before closing his eyes. He never forgot the young American soldier who knelt on a road in Tunisia and bandaged the wound of a man who spat in his face. He never stopped being ashamed of the spit, and he never stopped trying to live in a way that was worthy of the kindness that Jimmy Dawson had offered him in the last days of Jimmy's life. Because Friedrich understood after 2 summers in Texas after a fire, in a letter, in a tablecloth, with blue flowers that true strength does not roar. It does not conquer. It does not demand submission. Sometimes true strength is a 22-year-old soldier wrapping a bandage around the shoulder of his enemy while that enemy spits in his face. And then writing home to his father in the last letter he will ever write, saying simply this: Dad, I am not angry. If this story touched something inside you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this, stories about mercy in the middle of hatred, about kindness in the shadow of war, about two families on opposite sides of the world connected by a single act of grace, these stories need to be told again and again. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And remember what Jimmy Dawson knew, what Friedrich Eckhart learned, and what Hal Dawson lived by every day for the rest of his life. The way you treat people when you have the power. That is who you really are.